Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Natalie Boymel Kampen Memorial Lecture here at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. My name is Elizabeth Castelli, and I'm the director of BCRW, as well as a professor of religion here at Barnard College. Before introducing this evening's event, I want to begin with some expressions of gratitude to all of the people whose labor makes this evening's event possible. BCRW staff, including Administrator Pam Phillips, Senior Associate Director Miriam Neptune, Program and Communications Manager Avi Cummings, as well as special thanks to Creative Director Hope Dechter and our Post-Baccalaureate Fellow Sophie Kreitzberg, who are both keeping everything running smoothly on the tech side of things, as well as Student Research Assistant Eve Glazier. Tonight's ASL interpreters are Crystal Butler and William Mendez Gallardo from COCO Language Advocacy and Consulting. Rebecca Koster is tonight's captioner, and you can find the link to the captions below the video in the YouTube description, as well as on our website for this event. Tonight's lecture, The Deep History of Incarceration, is the Natalie Boymel Kampen Memorial Lecture, a now nearly annual event here at Barnard, sponsored by BCRW. Hope, could you bring up the photo of Tally, please? Natalie Kampen, or Tally, as everyone knew her, was a pioneering scholar of art history and gender. As a much beloved member of Barnard's faculty, from 1988 to 2009, Tally chaired the Women's Studies program at the college for many years and established strong foundations for the current Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She was the inaugural occupant of the Barbara Novak Chair in Art History at Barnard, as well as a valued member of the graduate faculty in art history at Columbia University. An internationally recognized scholar, Tally's research focused on Roman art and architecture of the imperial period. Her work took place at the intersections of art history, archaeology, classical studies, and feminist theory. Tally was dedicated to retrieving the social history from ancient visual evidence and material culture, and this project intersected with her feminist commitments to the restoration of the obscured lives of non-elite ancient women to our shared knowledge of the past. These overlapping commitments manifested themselves in her scholarship in books like Images and Status of Roman Working Women, 2nd and 3rd century reliefs from Ostia. She was also the author and editor of numerous other volumes, including her final publication, Family Fictions in Roman Art, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. Tally passed away in 2012, a few years after her retirement, but we keep her indomitable spirit in our midst by honoring her memory every year with a distinguished lecture delivered by a colleague, or tonight, colleagues, working in one or more of her fields of expertise. And I know that Tally would be very excited about tonight's lecture, The Deep History of Incarceration. Whether we are scholars of antiquity and the pre-modern world, serious or casual readers of Michel Foucault's canonical Discipline and Punish, activists seeking to end the practice of mass incarceration in the United States, or any combination of the above, we are all familiar with the nearly ubiquitous claim that the prison is a modern invention. Tonight's speakers are here to challenge that widespread received wisdom. In its place, they are building the case for a radically different history of imprisonment, a case based on deep research into the documentary archives and archaeological records of ancient imperial Rome. Their work is truly groundbreaking, both figuratively and literally, and it represents the best of recent efforts to bring new digital tools into the realm of humanities scholarship, as you will learn in the course of their talk. Tonight's lecture will be co-presented by two scholars who are engaged in a long-term collaborative research project on ancient practices of incarceration. Mark Letteney is currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California. He studies the history of incarceration, the history of epistemology, and the archaeology of military occupation. Matthew Larsen is associate professor in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Copenhagen. His current research centers on the history of incarceration, and he is staying up particularly late tonight in order to join us this evening. As we build connections among the various projects and commitments of BCRW, I'm deeply and sincerely thrilled to be able to bring the deep history of incarceration into engagement with BCRW's longstanding research into and activism around alternatives to mass incarceration. It's this series of crossings, the ancient with the contemporary, the scholarly with the activist, traditional methods with new technologies for sharing the fruits of research, that makes tonight's event so appropriate as a way to honor the memory of Natalie Kampen. As you listen to tonight's lecture, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll have time for a Q&A after the lecture, and we want everyone to be able to participate in that. And I invite you now to join me in welcoming Mark Letteney and Matthew Larsen to BCRW's virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It is a truly great honor to be here. We were honored to receive this invitation. Matthew and I have a regular standing writing time a few times a week, and the most recent one where we were going over the script and what we wanted to say tonight, Matthew said to me something that we were both thinking, which was, I can't believe we get to do this. We're so excited to be here and so honored by the invitation. And with that, I'll start. So today we want to offer an account of incarceration in the ancient world. Not so much a picture as a mosaic, pieced together through fragmentary evidence, much like the mosaic you see here, offering clues into the history of one of humanity's most durable institutions, the prison. We live in the age of mass incarceration. The most recent edition of the World Prison Population List reported in October of 2021 that there were at least 10.77 million people in prison globally, with the largest proportion of people behind bars in the United States. While the US accounts for approximately 4% of the world's population, we hold nearly 20% of the world's prisoners, a population which has exploded in the last 40 years, and which has come to the public's attention largely in the last 10 years as a result of pioneering work by scholars and activists like Michel Alexander, Mariame Kaba, and others. Still, a flawed understanding of the history of incarceration has hamstrung attempts to think past it by reformers and abolitionists alike. So in influential accounts like that of Didier Fasson, begins with the assertion, quote, prison is a recent invention, end quote. As a result of this constant scholarly refrain, a standard argument for the abolition of prison is there was a time before the prison, and so there can be a time beyond it. The history of the prison matters because even those of us advocating for its abolition base our arguments in its past. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we will try to piece together evidence for our incarceration in the ancient world. In a lecture of this sort, typically we would skip over the history of scholarship. In this case, however, the history of scholarship matters because it continues to form the basis of our attempts to think beyond the prison. And the history, as it's typically told, is wrong.
Mark, let me just, we're not seeing slides. Is it, do we need to?
Yes. Oh, are the slides not being shared? I'm sorry. Okay, are the slides up now?
Yes, they're coming. There
Great.
we are.
Okay, sorry for that. These are the two slides that you missed. mosaic and the World Prison Population List, which is available at prisonstudies.org. So as a general rule, historians don't look for ancient prisons because they don't think that there are any to be found. Prison studies is a new and rapidly growing field whose origins are inflected by Michel Foucault's landmark 1975 publication, published in English as Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. As his subtitle suggests, Foucault argued that the prison was born in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and in the US. Historians have recognized that ancient societies had sites for detention, but to date, most historians regard such places as mere pits or dungeons, wholly removed from broader social, political, and bureaucratic systems. This idea that prisons were marginal, disconnected, and frankly unimportant comes from Theodor Mommsen, perhaps the father of modern classics, who used prescriptive legal sources to describe Roman social practice. That is, he read sources that described an ideal world as if they described the world as it was. In 1899, he argued that Romans did not use prisons for punishment, but rather solely as a place of brief pretrial detention, or as a jail in modern parlance. Mommsen's position on prisons was so influential that for the better part of the 20th century, questions about the role of prisons in the ancient Mediterranean world remained unasked and unanswered. So this is the scholarly field upon which the study of prisons largely takes place. On one side stands Foucault, pitching the prison's birth in the late 18th century, while Mommsen returns volley, confirming the absence of prisons in the ancient world.
Some Roman jurists, like Oppian, lament the use of incarceration as a punishment for convicted criminals. But in so doing, they also attest to its widespread use. For instance, writing in the early 3rd century, Oppian complained, "Governors usually sentence criminals to be confined in prison or to be held in chains, but they shouldn't do this. Penalties of this kind are forbidden. Rather, a prison should be used for confining people, not as their punishment." 100 years later, though, a law of Constantine made judicially clear what was already widely practiced, at least as far as we can tell from the 500 or so sources that we related to incarceration that we have collected in preparation for our forthcoming book. Constantine ordered, "Prisons are for punishment. Prisons are for guilty people." The mistake that Mommsen made was to read prescriptive sources about what society should look like as if they were descriptive statements about how ancient society was. And our approach has been different.
We want to look through the cracks and fissures of normative systems to understand conditions on the ground. Much like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which notes that legal intentions are a poor guide to social outcomes, we have tried to read legal sources critically and to give documentary and archaeological evidence at least equal voice, bringing together fragmentary evidence to form a composite picture, a mosaic, if you will. In this, we build on the pioneering work of such scholars such as Pilar Pavón-Torrejón and Julia Hillner, who have gone before us, and who have supplied pieces of the mosaic to which we now turn. We will discuss 4 topics. First, the prison as space. Second, the prison as a social and economic tool. Third, the prison as punishment. And fourth, the prison as experience. We begin with the prison as space. If you ask most historians of the ancient world, what did a Roman prison look like? They would either say, "I don't know," or they would perhaps point to the most famous prison in the ancient world, the Mamertine prison on the Roman Forum. This space was rather simple. It comprised an upper and lower prison directly adjacent to the social and economic center of the city of Rome, and it was a permeable space. Walking through the Roman Forum, you would have been able to see and hear and perhaps smell and touch people inside. In the late 1st century BCE, the Roman architect Vitruvius wrote that the forum of every Roman city should have 3 things: a meeting house, a treasury, and a prison, each in proportion to the size of the forum and, by general extension, the population of the town. As Rome the city became Rome the empire and settlements across the Mediterranean grew in imitation of Rome, peculiarly Roman-style prisons sprang up across the empire. Here we see the civic prison of the Roman settlement of Cosa, north of Rome on the west coast of Italy. Like at Rome, again, the prison is directly adjacent to the forum. Or consider, for instance, the civic prison at the city of Jamila in modern-day Algeria. This prison was constructed in the late 1st century CE at the very center of the city. You see here the forum and the courthouse on the same level and directly communicating with each other. And directly below the courthouse is the prison. Here's the site as it looks now. On the left, you see the main street in the city running directly past the entrance to the prison. And the entrance to the prison is on the right with Matthew for scale. In this 3D model, going inside the prison from the main street, you see that there's a small vaulted antechamber on the other side of a significant threshold and gate, and 2 rooms. A first room, which has vaulted ceilings and some light, and an inner room, which looks lighter because the ceiling has fallen in, but which would have been quite dark. A gate, or a threshold for a gate here, stands between the antechamber in room 1 and between room 1 and room 2. In this more traditional drawing, you'll see that to the left of the entrance to the prison is a stairwell, which is in fact the back entrance to the courthouse, the place where judicial pronouncements to loose and to bind were handed down. So at Jamila, the place of judgment is literally above the place of confinement. This is a theme that we'll see again later. We want to stress that part of the Roman ideology of carcerality that we can read from these civic prisons is the power of the state literally over bodies. Even when civic prisons are not physically underneath the seat of judicial power, the connection between judgment above and bodies below continues to be expressed in various ways. For instance, here we have the mosaic of the captives, which decorated the judicial seating area in the courthouse in the coastal Roman colony of Tipasa. So it was in use in the same period when the Jamila prison was in use inland. Here again, we see the theme of civic judgment over bodies. Rather than having the prison underneath the courthouse, however, at Tipasa, they decorated the floor of the city courthouse with the bodies of captives. Here, a family of native Berbers, stripped and bound. Rather than sitting above the prison itself, judges at Tipasa sat over a depiction of vanquished bodies. There's a lot more to say about Tipasa, but we've got more work to do. So let's move about 100 miles southeast to Lambesis to talk about military prisons. Here we have a reconstruction of the fortress of the Roman Third Legion, established around 120 CE at Lambesis in modern-day Algeria. Right at the center of the base, there is the Sanctuary of the Standards, the temple where the flags and symbols of the legion were kept. Directly underneath this temple is the legionary prison. 8 stairs descend from the portico servicing the sanctuary through, again, a hefty gate into a space with 5 cells, each boasting significant amounts of graffiti scratched into the limestone field stones with poor tools. On the right, you see one of the cells. Windows supplied the little bit of light that passed to the underground space, the light that prisoners used to scratch the graffiti on the wall. Each cell has one of these small windows, opening from the cell directly to the public street, which runs behind the base's command post. Looking at these windows from the outside, from the level of the public street, we see that not only was it possible to pass objects through from one side to another, but in fact, they were used that way. On the left, you see the window into cell A, which was apparently not very much used, and it retained relatively pristine condition. The window into cell B, however, on the right, is significantly worn down from objects and hands being passed through for decades, possibly for centuries. So what are these for? They're for interacting with prisoners. From the Ptolemaic period through the early Byzantine period, the most common complaint that we see in prisoner letters is that they will die in prison if someone that they know does not come by with food or with money to purchase food. Roman prisons were centrally located. Further, there are not different types of prisons for different types of prisoners. So, for instance, we don't have special wards for military prisoners and different ones for civil prisoners. Rather, different prisons refer to different imprisoning authorities. Literary sources like Christian martyr acts and letters from Roman governors point to the use of military prisons like this one here at Lambesis in the same capacity as the civic prisons, like the one at Jamila discussed just a moment ago.
More than just being a space, the ancient prison was also a social and economic tool. There is some evidence to suggest that in an earlier period, civic prisons like the one in Athens were used as a tool for political retribution, as Marcus Fulch has recently argued. During the same period, the hundreds of civil prisons that dotted the Egyptian countryside under the dynasty of the Ptolemies were used for something more insidious: economic extraction. This primary function continued in the Roman and Byzantine periods. Reading prisoner letters and bail receipts, the overwhelming sense that one gets is that the prison was used by governmental and private entities in a manner that resonates unsettlingly with the current prison industrial complex. That is, as a tool to extract money and labor from marginalized populations. And like today, this may not have been the stated intention of prisons, the stated legal intention, but it was certainly the effect. Documentary sources are plentiful. These are sources like prisoner lists, letters from the incarcerated, and bail receipts. Above all, they speak to the prison as a tool for economic extraction. So for instance, here we have a prisoner list noting which prisoners were still incarcerated and which had been released on bail. It reads, "Account of names of people cast into the prison. They are Patricus, Dorothea," and then we have a large gap, as you can see, stands after these two names, leaving room for more names to be added. And the text continues, "The bail has been provided as follows: Christophoros, son of Psiu, by Petros, the scribe for Maria, the daughter of Tauriscus, by Amma Isis, for Theodote by Theodora, etc., etc." On the one hand, this prison roll points to something that we see throughout the documentary record from 300 BC onward. Prison management was a thoroughly bureaucratized system. The prison was not an ad hoc institution. Prison people with specific offices and discernible titles were tasked with keeping the prison's papers in order. Incarceration was a funded, organized service of the state. On the one hand, the prison roll also suggests that even long after the reforms of Constantine in 340, dictating that women should not be incarcerated together with men, nevertheless, the incarceration of women alongside men was commonly practiced. It was not something particularly worthy of special mention to the late antique individual who produced this particular list, that a woman, Dorothea, and a man, Patroclus, were apparently incarcerated together. That is to say, records like this tell us again that reading prescriptive legal sources does not offer insight into how incarceration worked on the ground. The vast majority of letters and bail receipts that we have cataloged relate to monetary extraction. For instance, this papyrus from 7 BCE, we see an indebted woman using incarcerated slaves as a guarantee for her own debt. It reads, Trophaeus to Athenodorus her son and Artemis her daughter. Many greetings and good health always. You did not pay the fine, nor is anyone able to free the slaves. Each day I am pestered by 2 bailiffs, Socrates and Elamon, because I am in debt. I have often written to you to care for the slaves. They will die in prison. Please listen to me and lock up the grain and give nothing to anyone. For on the 15th, it went up 3 obols, and they fear that it may become more expensive. Trophaeus wrote to her son and daughter, asking them to look after the slaves that she had left in prison as a collateral for her own debt. She claimed to be playing the grain market, waiting for prices to rise so that she could sell at a favorable rate and pay back her debt. In the meantime, she sent her slaves to sit in prison. Because of the neglect of her son and daughter, the people she had enslaved were now at risk of death in prison as a result of poor conditions and lack of food. Ancient prisons were supported by tax dollars. We have cataloged dozens of tax registers demonstrating that across antiquity, taxes supported the prison, which was seen as a public good. Even in late antiquity, after the breakdown of some forms of centralized control, we see private prisons being used for public purposes. People keeping estate prisons as a sort of tax paid in kind, open and available for public use. As we've argued, carceral systems often involve a significant gap between intention and effect. When ancient sources discuss the intention behind prisons, the aims are rather modest, relating to control, extraction, and state power. There are some glimpses, however, of more thoroughgoing ideologies of incarceration. Already in the 4th century BCE, Plato described 3 types of prisons in the ideal state. There are to be 3 prisons in the state. The first of them is to be the public prison in the agora for detaining general offenders. Another is to be in the area of the nocturnal council and is to be called the Reformatory. Another one, situated in some wild and desolate region in the middle of the countryside, is to be named after Retribution. Now, we'll discuss penal incarceration in a moment. Reformatory incarceration is typically understood as a unique legacy of the early modern period, with Foucault's comment as an outlier, a man ahead of his time. Yet again, by paying attention to the documentary record and allowing it to help us understand literary sources like this one, we find a slightly different picture. For instance, here we have a dedicatory inscription from 235 or 236 CE from modern day Turkey, and it reads, Penamos, according to the enlightenment given by the gods, and then you can see a crescent and a pair of eyes in the picture, by Zeus and men the great Artemidorus, quote, I have punished Theodorus in respect to his eyes in consequence for the sins which he committed. Theodorus goes on to explain the nature of his crimes and the sacrifices that he has made to expiate the guilt. The inscription ends with Theodorus saying, I have Zeus as my legal advocate, And Zeus responds, "Behold, I have blinded him in consequence for his actions, but now he has made good his mistakes by propitiating the gods and by erecting an inscribed stele." Then we have here, asked by the council, quote, "I am merciful because my stele was erected on the day I appointed. You may open the prison. I release the condemned after 1 year and 10 months have passed." Here we see the concept of reformatory incarceration. In the middle of the 3rd century CE, long before the Christian ideology of reformatory incarceration was ported from the public into the world of monasteries. The prison in antiquity was a central place in the social matrix and used as a tool for social control and economic extraction.
Among the most repeated and misleading historical facts about the Roman world is the idea that prisons were not used as places of punishment. Roman jurists, these are lawyers, professional lawyers, had an idea of penal incarceration, though unfortunately we don't have time to get into that here. Further, many ancient communities impacted by practices of incarceration viewed it as a form of punishment. And it is to our discredit that we sacrifice the experiences of the incarcerated at the altar of judicial intention. For instance, in the mid-2nd century CE, the Christian philosopher Justin Martyr wrote a petition recounting the story of a certain man named Ptolemy, who, when he, quote, confessed that he was a Christian, the centurion punished him in the civic prison for a long time, end quote. Many things about this scenario are not clear. But what is clear is that Justin categorized incarceration as a form of punishment in his petition to the Roman authorities, and that his incarceration lasted a substantive amount of time. This anecdote signals another often repeated idea that prisons were only used to detain people for a very short time, perhaps a few days, and not used for long-term detention. While in the vast majority of instances documentation is lost, a surprising number of documentary sources do indicate length of time in prison. We have tracked the amount of time mentioned, and the range runs from several days to weeks to months, in even as much as 10 years. So a Roman biographer, for instance, reports that the Emperor Tiberius left people in prison in Rome for as long as 7 years. And we have ample letters from incarcerated people who claim that they had been left in prison for years on end, sometimes without knowing why they were imprisoned in the first place. The case of Caliph Browder jumps immediately to mind. It is often assumed that the real heart of the modern carceral system, the key aspect that was born in early modern Europe, was the idea of limited term sentences of incarceration. That is, sending someone convicted of specified crimes to a corresponding years of carceral punishment. Yet even this is not entirely modern. While folks were often left in prison for months and years without a clear legal basis, it was also the case that people were legally sentenced to specifically calibrated amounts of time of incarceration, as we saw assumed in the logic of the Theodorus inscription. These practices were specifically targeted at more socially vulnerable communities. There is evidence of the use of civic prisons as places where people were sent to experience punishment for a crime. The question of limited term sentencing becomes even more clear when we shift our frame of reference just slightly. Lower status people were specifically targeted for formal sentences of incarceration within mining camps, serving as free labor for the state economy. Again, it is hard to ignore resonances with the 13th Amendment. A number of texts illustrate this practice well, though we will focus on only 2 papyri. Each of these reflects the sentencing, completion of term, and release of prisoners from carceral spaces aimed specifically at economic extraction of labor from prisoners' bodies and materials from the earth. So one example of this practice comes from a papyrus written at the direction of the prefect of Egypt in 209 CE, documenting the release of a prisoner who had been sentenced to work in the mines and had been incarcerated there for a period of 5 years. It reads, from Subatianus Aquila to Theon, the governor of the Arsinoite district. Greetings. Nigerus, son of Papyrus, whom the most honorable Claudius Julianus condemned to the alabaster mine for a period of 5 years, and who has completed the time of his sentence, I release. Limited term sentencing and release was rather common, it seems. Another papyrus from only a few months later, mentioning a letter from the same prefect of Egypt, reads, "A Nubian the governor writes, since the most illustrious prefect, Subatianus Aquila, sent me a letter concerning Isidorus, who is also called Kyraeus, who has completed the time of his sentence and has been released, this copy was sent to you all, so that you might know and act accordingly." Again, we see the bureaucracy at the center of the Roman carceral system, and the colonial Roman administrator pronouncing the completion of a carceral sentence. What this document fails to mention, however, is perhaps just as illuminating as what it clarifies. First, it does not mention how long the person had been incarcerated, only that he had completed his sentence. Second, it does not clarify where he had been incarcerated. While the mines is certainly one possible location, the language of the document allows the possibility that he had been detained in a public prison. Most examples of release after time served are from the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, and tend to have the name of the Roman prefect releasing the prisoner. This reinforces the authority of the prefect over the carceral state and over the extraction of state resources. Both mines and incarcerated labor for those mines are directly in his purview. It is interesting that the release is not ordered or signed by a local administrator, but rather from the very top of the Roman imperial bureaucratic system, from men who would have been quite accustomed to carceral practices known from across the broader empire. Other documents help us think in more concrete terms of the economic benefit produced for the state through carceral labor, and that such an issue was not unique to Roman imperial contexts. For instance, we have a report from a mine overseer in the 3rd century BCE. The report speaks of prisoners being sent to and from the mining facility and used as laborers to extract stone from a mine owned by the Ptolemaic king. In other words, we see a carceral system overseen by contract workers in which unfree laborers perform free labor for the benefit of the state. As historians of antiquity, our training has led us to assume that the past is a foreign place where they do things differently. No matter the topic, our assumption is that only a superficial look will render history more similar than different to the modern practice of the same. Especially when studying incarceration in antiquity, we were primed to see vast differences between ancient and modern worlds, despite a common lexicon of terms. And yet, the haunting parallels that we find continue to shock us. For instance, practices under the reign of the Emperor Tiberius strike a peculiarly modern tone. His biographer records that Tiberius held people in prison for long periods of time as a political tool, making unwanted members of society disappear. But what's more, the emperor ordered a practice that sounds disturbingly like solitary confinement. The emperor's biographer wrote, quote, "Some of those in custody and prison were denied not only the comfort of reading, but even the privilege of conversing and talking together." We don't know enough about how Tiberius could have put his intention into practice to directly compare how this relates to modern practices of solitary confinement. But it's still hard to find another modern English phrase to describe how Tiberius used incarceration as a punishment, other than to call it solitary confinement. This is not the only instance of what might be called solitary confinement either. Beginning with this biography and continuing through the 6th century CE, we find sources mentioning the isolation of prisoners as a heightened form of punishment. So we will offer just one more example. In the 4th century CE, an influential Christian monk named Pachomius established a set of regulations in his monastery, which involved laboring to produce goods that could be used or could be sold. At one point, the monastery superior assigned each monk to produce 1 mat per day. So the story goes, on one particular day, one of the monks produced 2 mats instead of the one he was assigned to make. The monk was pleased with his accomplishment and, hoping to receive praise for his effort, he smugly displayed both mats outside of his cell. When Pachomius saw the mats, however, he was so angry at what is described as the brothers', quote, thought of vainglory, unquote, that he sentenced this monk to be locked in his cell for 5 months. He was disallowed from receiving any visitors for those 5 months. Since the brothers' crime was related to commodity production, the head monk forced him to make 2 mats per day, while on a ration comprising only bread and salt. Again, from a contemporary perspective, it is hard not to view this as a limited term sentence of incarceration, including long-term solitary confinement with a punitive form of food rations.
And with this, we come to prison as experience. One thing for us in our research one surprise for us in our research has been the presence of a significant number of prisoner graffiti preserved in the record. These graffiti are likely to get us as close as we can to the lived experience of incarceration in the ancient world. In these scratches and doodles, we find tactics of survival and resistance, ranging from expressions of rage to mechanisms for coping with long days of boredom. We find a lot of tables among prisoner graffiti, such as the one pictured here from a floor tile in a late antique prison from Corinth in Greece. And we found similar tables inscribed on the wall of the prison in Lambaesis. In any one instance, the functions of these tables is not perfectly clear. They could be used for keeping track of time, and many bear a striking resemblance to ancient board games, or game boards, rather. Either way, they present a technology developed to deal with excess time and lack of activity. Carved directly onto the floor in the prison in Corinth, this board would have served as a part of the built environment for those within the prison, with each successive group of inmates benefiting from those before them who scratched the table. If this was used as a game board, which seems most likely in this instance, it also gestures to a sense of social life within this particular prison. Another graffito from Corinth, from the Corinth prison, offers us a glimpse into a different kind of technology addressing a different need. This inscription reads, "Sign of the cross," then it says, "Listen." And after listen, you can see here it draws an ear for hearing. So listen, an ear, and Lord, help your servant. This inscription seems to address a need, that is the need of a prisoner to receive a hearing, a fair hearing perhaps. One imagines someone leaning their body over this floor tile and using this etched ear on the floor to offer their prayer, Lord, help your servant. Prisons tended to be in the middle of cities, but constructed in a way that allows sound in easier than out. The perceived need to be heard, and to be heard and receive a fair hearing, is not hard to imagine. In addition to graffiti, we've cataloged over 100 letters from prisoners requesting help from outside. One here from Egypt in 177 BCE, an incarcerated person writes that he had been in, quote, the big prison in Crocodileopolis, and I have now been confined already for 3 years, lacking the necessities. In the 2nd century, a prisoner from Maresha in modern-day Israel inscribed a complaint, which reads in part, Zabatus sent this from the punishments, health and life. I believe to know that I am innocently near death, since it is 3 years ago that I was arrested, and because Theon came to have my possessions. It could hardly be clearer that Zabatus identifies his last 3 years in prison as a punishment, literally calling his place of incarceration the punishments, and one punishment with brutal economic effects. A 6th or 7th century potsherd contained a letter written on it from a woman named Thecla and her companion, who were both held in prison. They sent this letter to 2 men, with the potsherd's postage to be paid upon delivery by the men, and it reads, We were at pains and wrote to you, and you have forgotten us in the captivity where we are, while they hung us up backwards and took our breath out of our bodies, and you did not visit us. For we gave our life for you. Look, you have forgotten us. Do not trust the men, lest they kill us. For as the Lord lives, if you don't reach us today with the money, there will be no life left in us. Send the rations for us to the jailer and give loaves and then there's a break. Then don't fail to see that they reach us today. Otherwise, as the Lord lives, we will take 6 soldiers and come north and hand you over and all your affairs until they are paid. The few previous interpreters who have looked at this potsherd have scratched their heads about how these 2 incarcerated women could carry out such a threat to take 6 soldiers and come north. But this letter merely reflects a wider practice of using women as incarcerated collateral for men's debts. While several papyri mention this practice in late antique Egypt, this letter offers the perspective of the women suffering incarceration, who were treated so poorly that here they threatened to end the arrangement and sail north with 6 soldiers. Finally, we direct our attention to one last prisoner graffito. Echoing language from other prisoner inscriptions in Corinth, the incarcerated person scratched in large letters into this floor paving stone, May fortune overcome for the one toiling in this lawless place. Lord, show no mercy to the person who threw us in here. This person gave voice to what must have been a common sentiment among prisoners. And this graffito gestures in a different direction than both the writings of Roman lawyers and lawmakers with their intentions for incarceration as a system for just punishment, and from the ideals of Christian theologians who sought ways to imagine the prison as a positive place of spiritual redemption. For this person, however, the prison was a lawless place, not an institution of justice. And their captors were not servants of the state or any benevolent God. They were scoundrels on whom this graffito writer wished the deity would show no mercy.
We could continue, And we do so in our forthcoming book. Time has grown short, however, and we've tested your patience enough. So we will conclude with this. In the springs of 1897 and 1898, a group of 95 Algerian prisoners were put to work by their French captors. They were unpaid laborers, bodies used to excavate an archaeological site underneath the French colonial prison, itself built on top of the legionary base of another colonial power, the fortress of the Roman Third Legion. Here in this picture, you see the Roman legionary prison in the foreground, and in the background, the French colonial prison, where the Algerian laborers were housed. Thus, while it was not understood as such for another 120 years, one of the spaces that these prison laborers uncovered was the Roman legionary prison discussed just a bit ago, underneath the Sanctuary of Standards. In Latin, standards are called signa. Over the course of late antiquity, the word signa passed from Latin, simply referring to the flags of the legion, and came to refer, even in Latin, to what was often found nearby, the prison. When Roman rule faded and Coptic became the main administrative language of the area, the association continued. The old Latin word signa became signe in Coptic, referring no longer to military standards, but simply referring to a prison. As Coptic faded and Arabic grew as the local language, again the word remained. Still today, sijin in Arabic means prison, derived from the Coptic signe and ultimately the Latin military term signa, which referred to military standards that were kept, here lambesis, above the place of detention by an occupying colonial power. Unknowingly, in the springs of 1897 and 1898, Arabic-speaking prisoners were forced to excavate a site that would eventually help explain one part of their own experience of incarceration. The fact that the local Arabic-speaking community in Tazult, Algeria, still refers to this building as a sijin exemplifies how, then as now, one often finds oneself bound up unaware in larger histories, not always visible, yet nonetheless operative in subtle, formative ways.
In conclusion, we contend that it is no longer historically responsible to continue to repeat the line, "There once was a time when there were no prisons," pointing to its birth in the modern period. It's too simple and it's misleading. We must move past the prison, but we cannot do it unless we excavate its deep history. Many of the central features of the prison that were supposed to have been invented in the modern period were in fact already detectable in the ancient Mediterranean world. Economic extraction, penal incarceration, limited term sentencing, solitary confinement, and tactics of prisoner resistance. This material troubles our easy answers about the birth of the prison in the modern world. It suggests the prison is not a unique problem of modernity, but in fact a symptom of something more durable within human history. We suggest two possible options. One, we can ignore history altogether. The ancient world offers no solutions to mass incarceration, and history offers no tricks or shortcuts. And perhaps then it doesn't matter. We need to look to the future. As historians, however, you won't be surprised that we'd rather propose another option. That is the option of history as a mirror. While history offers no cures, it can improve our diagnosis of the present moral catastrophe of widespread incarceration. History allows us to see the choices that we as society make in fresh light, to see our reflections more clearly, and to understand, perhaps for the first time, those decisions which are unique to our moment and those structures which are bound up in larger histories. For example, this history can help us think differently about where we decide to build prisons. The decision to build mega prisons far outside centers of social life is a truly modern anomaly, and one which seems to have had a symbiotic relationship to the rise of mass incarceration. Unlike in the past, we have chosen to lock people away, out of sight, out of mind, in a way that has not always been possible. This history can also help us see the durability of economic extraction through incarceration. Incarceration is connected to a larger system of economic drivers, producing bodies to labor for both private and public interests. And this is not new. Its history in America is peculiar in its details, to be sure, but it coheres with the ancient material in broad strokes. History can help us see how the military and carceral apparatus are so clearly connected through time. As we saw in the mosaic of the captives, Romans used the same visual language to depict civic prisoners and military prisoners. The US only has the highest rate of prisoners in human history if we don't take wartime incarceration seriously as a concept, such as the hundreds of thousands of Jews mentioned by Josephus taken as prisoners in the Roman sack of Jerusalem. Perhaps this leads us to take this language about war on crime not as pure metaphor. History helps us to clarify something that is latent within present structures. The prison as a tool of social and economic control, rather than simply the answers to questions about law and order. Does this history resolve our crisis of mass incarceration? Not at all. But it is difficult to forge a better future for something when we are ignorant of the majority of its past, and especially its history in non-Western and pre-modern contexts. This deep history of incarceration sheds light on what may lie beyond the prison, which remains to be seen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you both so much. This was a mind-blowing talk, and as you know, I have heard you talk about your work before, and just dazzled by what you've uncovered in the research that you've done, and I can't wait for the book. And there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat. People are not waiting to pose their questions, so I want to turn directly to those so that we can let as many people as possible ask questions. So there is one question that says, I like how you connect Greek and Roman carcerality with their colonial occupation of North Africa. Please say more about how prisons functioned as part of a strategy for occupation and extraction. So I think reflecting obviously on the evidence coming from North Africa and from Egypt. We'll start with that one.
Yeah, so I'll start by talking about extraction, which is so the most important, or rather some of the most important marble quarries in North Africa are in modern day Algeria, Egypt, and Tunisia. And in the Roman period, these were part of an imperial monopoly. So all extraction of, for instance, the famous yellow marble came from one particular mine in the modern city of Chemtu in Western Tunisia. And the site is not just a mine, it's also a military base. The Roman military outpost was there to oversee the mine and to oversee the carceral facility that was built to house workers. This facility has 6 bays, so 6 sort of large cells, each of which are capable of holding around 200 or so prisoners. Which means that in total, at least notionally, what we have here is a military mine with a prison capable of holding well over 1,000 prisoners, used as labor to extract this prized material and send it all over the Mediterranean. And in fact, you find it everywhere all over the Mediterranean, including if you've ever been to the Getty Villa right here in Los Angeles. There's quite a bit of it there. So at least in terms of extraction, both in the Ptolemaic period and in the Roman period, we have ample instances of military and a military occupation being deeply connected to extraction of resources, and that extraction being built on the backs of enslaved and incarcerated laborers.
I'll just add very, very quickly one thing to that, is that elite Romans probably would have never seen the inside of a prison and would have never seen a mining camp where prisoners and slaves were being held together. And yet, as they strode across the marble and the alabaster of the floors of their houses, they were in fact coming into direct labor with the carceral state and with the Roman occupation that was happening throughout the empire. And so that's one of the places where we can, if we look at this history from a slightly different angle, we can see the ubiquity of this system making its way out. And I'll mention one other thing too, especially because I think Tally Kampen's history, interest in art history I'm bringing this out to kind of make that connection as well. But Romans picked images of prisoners of war as a way of depicting civic prisoners. And they depicted these prisoners strategically as orientalized captives. And it was a way of showing Roman occupation and dominance. And they put them in civic centers. And so we can see this kind of visual transcript, kind of a public transcript for thinking about carcerality and captivation of bodies, and how it links directly with Roman occupation and how it links with extraction. And incarceration gives us a lens for seeing how these things are actually all interrelated.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking a lot while you were talking about the deeply spectacular nature of Roman visual culture. The constant sort of repetition of images that articulate that sort of dominance that you're talking about, and release all over Rome of prisoners, as a kind of statement about political power. So it's the kind of interlocking of these different registers of social control and political control are really central. There was a question in the chat about the ages of people who were incarcerated. This came from Carrie Schroeder, who was interested, of course, in children in monastic communities. Can you say something about beyond issues of class and gender, but also speaking about age? What do we know?
Mark, do you want to bring up the mosaic of the captives slide? Is that possible to bring up? Because this helps us think about this issue.
I think I'm still sharing.
As he's doing that, I'll mention this is another place where, again, if you read legal sources as though they set the terms of engagement, and then we need to find ways of taking all these documentary evidence and making them somehow fit with that, we would say, well, obviously you're not going to find children incarcerated. And Romans really only rarely, and they really don't like the incarceration of women. In the visual transcript, you can see this is not the case, because here you have a man who's being depicted in a civic space where civic people who have been called up from the prison and facing trial. But he's represented sitting on what appears to be a shield. And he's next to, this appears to be a family. The woman is not stripped, but is bound. And behind them is their child. And we have found sources that talk about children in prison, and including infants, of course, we hear about this in this story from the Passion of Perpetua, that she is there with an infant. But we see other documentary evidence corroborating this. And so we do see evidence of children, and we obviously the record is just far too patchy and lumpy to speak about any kind of sociological statistics on age. But I do feel confident saying that we really do see a broad spectrum of people being incarcerated, and oftentimes you'll see whole families being incarcerated together.
Could you say a little bit more about the women you referenced who are incarcerated as collateral for men's debts? That's such a chilling sort of idea, and yet there are resonances in our own carceral system of women essentially being imprisoned because they were party to criminal activity by the men in their lives, and they end up doing time as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is one of the things I think that most surprised us when we really started to dig into the documentary sources, is that we saw not only a lot of women in prison, but a lot of women who were in prison, not out of prison on bail, but in prison as bail. And this structure we find as early as the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, as early as the 3rd century BCE. And as you saw in this letter on a potsherd from the 6th or 7th century, it continues into late antique Egypt. So it's an extremely durable sort of operation. And what seems to be happening in most cases, and what's explicitly mentioned in some sources, is that a woman does not have the sort of economic capacity that a man does. And yet men are often responsible for debts. And so what they will do is they will put their wife in prison as their bail and go and work at their trade until such time as they can pay off the debt. So we have one letter from late antique Egypt, for instance, in which a man says he's a mail carrier. And so not only does he need to be let out of prison, he seems to be in prison with his whole family. So he needs to be let out. He needs his horse back so that he can carry the mail, but his wife can stay as debt collateral. And we see these sorts of operations happening quite a bit, especially in the case of lower class laborers who don't have money or objects available to give as debt collateral. And so they use bodies instead. The only other thing I'll mention is in this letter that we saw from Truffas, see if I can pull up. So we have this woman named Truffas who is herself indebted. And she is, rather than being in jail herself, she has again used the bodies of someone else as debt collateral, in this case, people that she has enslaved. And I remember the first moment that Matthew and I really understood what this was. We translated it for ourselves, and when you're translating, you kind of are in the you're in the Greek, and it's hard to really get a sense. And then you look at your own translation, and you have this moment. And I remember having this moment, and we had to get off Zoom because we needed to take a walk to thinking about just the barbarity of this system in which a woman is playing the grain markets, waiting for prices to rise so that she can pay off her debts cheaper. In the meantime, she's put people that she's enslaved in prison, and she's writing to her son and daughter saying, you can't forget to feed them because they're going to die. And her concern there is not for the lives of the people that she's enslaved. It's for doubling her debt by losing the people that she had put in there as collateral. And so we see these structures sort of insidiously working their way through all sorts of power structures. Sometimes it's husbands incarcerating their wives, and sometimes it's enslavers incarcerating the people that they've enslaved.
And where this, the practice specifically of taking a woman or someone's wife as collateral seems to have emerged from is in an earlier period. We have lots of letters saying, listen, I'm not saying I don't owe a debt, or I'm not saying I didn't commit this crime, but what I am saying is if you don't let me out of prison right now, my bees or my herd or this field or something, it's going to go to ruin, and this is going to cause rippling economic effects for this local community. So I need you to let me out of prison for this period. And this later practice seems to have grown out of that.
Thank you for that. There are some questions in the chat about whether, in addition to the resistance that one sees in the inscriptions that you showed us at the very end of your talk, that gave us at least a suggestive snapshot of the lives of imprisoned people, is there any evidence of any kind of broader social protest against the practice of incarceration in antiquity? We live in a moment now where there is a movement around abolition and alternatives to incarceration and so on. Did anything like this exist in this period that we know of? Any critique?
I would actually list this famous line from Ulpian that, Mark, if you want to kind of toggle back to that. This is usually taken as the proof text for Romans didn't really use prisons. But actually, I read Ulpian, Mark and I read Ulpian as he's not the emperor. He's a legal reformer. And what he's saying is people are using prisons this way. And he's vocalizing a desire to, you could call it protest against that. You don't have protest movements in the same way that we're seeing it right now in our moment. But you do see prison reform movements. So there's a letter from the orator, the late 4th century orator Libanius on the poor conditions of the prison. And there's too many people in prison, and they're not being heard trial, and they're dying in prison, and so on and so forth. And you have this, and then you have prison legislation starting with Constantine and running up through Honorius in 410 and beyond, that are specifically focused on trying to reform the prison. So they're not thinking about prison abolition, but they are thinking about prison reform. In that context, usually it's specifically in late antique Christian ways. I don't know if Mark, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add there do seem to be some localized responses in parts of the empire earlier. So as Matthew mentioned, our first real attempt at what might be called a systematic sort of prison reform movement arises in the sources in the 4th century, probably because most of our legal sources are from the 4th century and beyond, right? So it's hard to say, how much Ulpian, for instance, is reflecting a popular sentiment. Nevertheless, we do have some regional responses. Like we have this interesting fragmentary inscription from North Africa, from modern day Algeria, which says that anybody who is from the city who is incarcerated should be paid, or rather should be fed by people from the city, right? So there's at least sort of localized attempts to deal with some of the excesses of prison conditions. And in this case, the concern was somebody from our own community may die for lack of food in prison. And so we're going to set up a local law saying that anybody from this city should be fed on the public dime if they're in prison. So it's probably a virtue more of the archive and the nature of our sources that we can't say much more than that. But we do have these interesting little windows into reform efforts and into attempts to sort of deal with some of the worst excesses of the prison if you look hard enough.
Thank you. You make a really great case in your presentation and in your forthcoming book that there are many, many parallels and important similarities between what was happening in antiquity and in the current moment. And you speak at the end about holding up, using antiquity as a kind of mirror for our own moment. But in paying attention to points of similarity, are there things that you still would say are indisputably different about this ancient world's prisons? That is, I mean, you talked a little bit about them being in the center of the forum, for example, which is rather different from what happens in contemporary society and so on. But are there other differences that are meaningful differences that you would want to highlight, even as you're trying to, I think, make a bigger, broader argument about points of continuity across time that correct the inherited story that we've all been telling for a long time that we will now not do anymore because we're on.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are several. I mean, to be honest, one of the things that comes most, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked that was, in many ways, the Romans were fairly explicit about the inequality in the system in a way that, and a lot of people are doing a lot of work in critical prison studies to show actually this system is incredibly unfair. It's incredibly unfair to Black people, to communities of color, to poor communities. And if you look at it, you can actually. But the Romans just came out and said, no, if you're an elite person, you're going to have to go to your summer house for a couple of years, and if you are less than that, then you're going to go to prison. And they had specific codes that were directly pointed towards targeting lower social status people, and they were explicit about that. So that is at least, that was the first example that came into my mind. Maybe one other thought, but and then I'll hand it off to Mark, is it's again a similarity, but it's something of a difference. Like, our carceral system is connected with economic drivers, and the ancient one was also connected with economic drivers, and yet they're very different. Like, we don't seem to work with debt incarceration in quite the same way now as they did then. And debt, if we were to catalog the reason for incarceration in our papyrological sources, debt would absolutely be the highest number. So that also seems to be a meaningful difference, but I'm sure Mark will have more to say here.
Yeah, I'd say there are two, I think, more major differences that come immediately to mind. One is picking up on the ubiquity of debt incarceration, is the ability of private individuals to mobilize the carceral apparatus. Whereas there are ways to get somebody arrested today. If you're an elite person, you have to at least go through some version of the official channels, or there's some sort of nodding to due process. In the Ptolemaic sources and in the Roman sources, we see overwhelmingly, again, debt incarceration is the overwhelming rationale for the reason people are incarcerated. And it is rarely the state saying you owe a tax debt. It's often a local rich person saying, this person owes me money, and thereby by virtue of complaining to often the state tax office, public facilities are used for something that looks like private incarceration. On the other side, in late antiquity, private prisons are often used for public incarceration. So the sort of the entangling of public and private is something that is, I think, fundamentally different. The last thing I'll say is that prisons in antiquity are remarkably under-theorized in an emic sense. Ancient people did not think about what the prison was used for, what it was intended for, and whether those intentions and the results match up in any thoroughgoing way. With the exception of this quotation from Plato, there's a lot of discussion of the prison, but not why it's there. There's a sort of assumption of its status and its virtues. Whereas today, you can read whole bookshelves of legal intention about what prisons are supposed to do. Now, as many scholars have shown in carceral studies, it is very rarely the case that the intentions and the effects actually match up. But there are intentions. There is a thoroughgoing legal ideology of incarceration that is at least notionally consistent within legal systems and within the American legal system, especially, that just does not exist in antiquity. And I think that's striking for us.
Can I add two more? I mean, our system is so driven by race as a factor in incarceration. People debate whether that concept exists in the ancient world, but whether it does or doesn't, it doesn't work in the same way. But what does seem to function is citizenship. Citizenship and foreignness. Like, what you really don't want to be is a foreigner in someone else's prison. And this relates to the other point, which is how you get food, which is related to where you're located, which is also related to, if you happen to be put in prison in your town, you're still going to see your family and your friends on a regular basis. I mean, they're going to be able to come by the window, and you're counting on them to bring you bread, and to bring you water, and to bring you whatever else, that lamps, whatever else you might need. But you're in regular contact with the community that you would have been living in. And that's another, I think, meaningful difference from the systems that we've created in the modern world, where there's such a strong break from community.
Thank you. That's a really important set of things to keep in mind about the constructedness of both of these sets of systems, both in antiquity and in the present. I have a really more detailed question, and then I want to wrap up with a closing question about how we stretch this all across time. The more detailed question came up in the chat and had to do with literacy in relationship to imprisoned people. And it was very striking with some of the graffiti at the end, where it seems that there are people who are imprisoned who at least have some functional capacity to write. And just if you could say a little bit more about, do you draw any broader conclusions about imprisoned populations' assumptions about literacy, which, we are still wrestling with the percentages of people who had various levels of capacity to read and write in antiquity and so on.
Yeah, Matthew, do you want to talk about the graffiti and I'll talk about the papyri?
I was just about to say the same. Good, that's perfect. So, just from Corinth, we've got about 25 paving stones with graffiti on them. So it's actually a significant amount. And it's not really enough to draw any kind of statistical conclusions, but it does bring up the exact questions that you were raising, which is, wait a second, these people are in prison, and I'm assuming that most people in prison are not the kind of highly educated elites of the city, and yet there's an ample amount of them that can write. And we know there were many more. I mean, if you go to the site now, you can see the kind of fragments of graffiti that were on the wall. So probably at one point you have four large cells lined up with graffitis all over the floor and all over the wall, and it makes me think. It makes me want to rethink the degree to which people were able to write. Now, I mean, they're also echoing each other. So this one says this phrase, and you can see this one kind of picking up this phrase and using it here. And it seems to me that some of them are strategically not using names. So it doesn't saying, I, Matthew, offer this curse or prayer. It's kind of, it becomes a device that any person in that space can use, and it's fairly simple. So it's also not kind of a binary between can write and can't write. It's like there's probably a spectrum of degrees. And then there are some that are just drawing or kind of doodling. So we can't really draw firm conclusions from that, but it does raise exactly the issues that I think you're raising. And Mark will talk about papyri now, which have a different angle.
Yeah, so we have, as we mentioned, about 120, between 120 and 150 prisoner letters that we have compiled and translated and commented on. And one of the things that we find is that they're very formulaic. In particular, there's often this question of how are these letters being produced? And where are they coming from? How is somebody in prison writing? And one of the things that Matthew and I have found is that we found what might be between 3 and 5 papyri, prisoner letters written by the same scribe for different prisoners. Remarkably similar handwriting, remarkably similar format for how the letter looks on the piece of papyrus, and remarkably similar phrasing, such that if you put them together, it almost reads like ad libs. You add in the name of the prisoner, the various complaints, the name of the person that it's going to, and sort of send it off. And so one of the reasons, I mean, one of the ways that we start to explain this archive is it seems to be that professional writers are dropping by civic prisons from time to time to take dictation from people even who cannot write. There's even one papyrus, and Ryan Baumann pointed this out when we gave a talk a couple months ago, that is written in extremely fat characters in Greek, such that you could make a case that it was written in very poor light conditions, and possibly that this is actually somebody who is incarcerated, who has the ability to write, who has the capacity to write, has been brought a stylus and ink and papyrus, and is trying to scratch out a letter in the limited light that's available. So we see sort of the entire spectrum, from people who seem to be completely illiterate, who are using professional scribes, people who are writing for themselves, but offering these prayers and messages that could be accessed by other people, and then also folks who are possibly writing themselves in the prison.
Great. I'm going to squeeze in one more question. Actually, it's 2 more questions, but I'm going to say them at the same time. The first is from the audience. You started by linking the claim that prisons are a recent invention to the abolitionist vision of a world without prisons. How do you see the deep history of incarceration being taken up by abolitionist organizing? So that brings us back into the present. And the other present question I want to ask, or maybe it's a future question, is who's publishing your book and when will we be able to read it?
Matthew, do you want to start us out?
The second one is easier to answer.
I was going to take that one.
It's being published with the University of California Press, and it's going to be published with a companion website, which will show a lot of these sources. And the manuscript is due back to them by the summer. So that's what we're aiming for. We have a little bit of writing left to do, so I hope it, we're hoping to meet that goal. I'll take a shot at the abolitionist question. This project for me emerges from a commitment to undoing mass incarceration as we know it. So I began working on this because of conversations that I was having in New Haven with Titus Kaffar and Dwayne Betts, when I was working on a different topic, and they were both working then, as they still are, on thinking about incarceration a lot. And I began thinking, and I began looking and saying, how can it be that people aren't interested in talking about this in the past? Because I study early Christianity. I know that these sources mention it. And so I began looking into it. Early on in the process, I had a conversation with a philosophy professor who said, this is very bad news for prison abolitionists like me. And I was kind of caught off guard. And I said, why is that? And he said, because I love to be able to stand up in front of a room and say there was a time when there were no prisons. And so there can be a time when there will be no prisons. And I had to have a good think about that one. And the conclusion was, yes, but that's not historically true. And I think I think the mirror metaphor, if I could try one other metaphor, is to say, when we try to think about what is beyond the prison as we know it, this history helps us think in 2D, in 3D rather than 2D. And it helps us think, the fact that we can now say we have a broader way of conceptualizing how slavery and incarceration and other kinds of unfreedom all relate to each other. If we were able to just eliminate all prisons starting in 2023, the power structures that created that would still need to be addressed, or else something else is going to come in its place. And this history helps us think about what could be after that, and how we can navigate in a kind of fog towards what might be a more just future for all people.
Mark, did you want to let that be the last word, or did you want to say?
I'm not going to say it better than he did. So.
Okay, excellent. I want to thank you both so much. This was such an amazing presentation, and your the questions and your responses just enriched it even further. And we're so grateful to you. We learned so much from you. So thank you to the audience for staying with us and asking great questions. And the talk is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, so others who didn't get to see it today or want to return to it and look at the sources more carefully can do that. And please come to the rest of the Scholar and Feminist Conference, which is ongoing this spring. Check our website for the dates and times of those last events. And thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.